Okay, so I'm going to do firstly the run through the chronology of what this event was, the Global Futures Forum, run from New York, and I'll make a few little comments as I go through that. Okay, that's the first part of the talk. And then the second point is I've got 12, bullet points I want to raise arising from that experience and how we as the World Intellectual Forum might take that forward, what response we might want to do, what were the lacunae in their program, if any, and then we can, and so those 12 bullet points, then I'll finish and then we can have a discussion arising. I'm sure you'll think of other things that, other critiques and so on. Right, okay, so the event took place, it was called the Global Futures Forum. It took place on the 20th and 21st of March, just gone. And it was run from a couple of event places in New York City, right by the UN, 777 UN Plaza, which is where most of these events take place. And it was actually based in the Church Center for the United Nations, which is a kind of a big area that you can hire. They'd obviously got to deal with the Church's Center to use their facilities. To begin with, it was a bit chaotic. We couldn't hear very well. The technical side was a bit naff, a bit amateur. But finally, after about half an hour, it got underway. The opening plenary. Okay, let me just explain the context. So, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Gutierres, who's a Portuguese guy, former politician, social democrat, a leading intellectual in his own right, has called for a World Summit of the Future to be hosted at the United Nations headquarters in 2024, so next year in September. And he put out a call for all NGOs and also governments to sort of do some thinking, to get our thinking caps on and decide, well, what kind of a world do we want to live in? What should the future look like? Which is quite a unique opportunity for us to get involved in thinking this through. And this event, called the Global Futures Forum, was organized by the NGO community and open to NGOs like ours. And it was partly sort of them saying what they're planning. They'd been working on this behind the scenes for several months leading up to this event. And then they were saying, well, it's over to you. What do you think? We had working groups we were discussing in the course of these working groups. Right, so the opening plenary, we heard from one of the coordinators of the forum, a young woman called Nodara Yusuf. Although at that point, we couldn't very much hear what she was saying, but she was making some useful statements, I'm sure. Then we heard from the permanent representative of Qatar to the United Nations. That's like the ambassador from Qatar. Several UN ambassadors were there. And this young woman from Qatar spoke. We then heard from Guy Ryder, who is a UN official. He's actually the Under Secretary General for Policy, which is quite an important role. His job is what is the future policy for the UN? What direction should it go in? And he spoke extremely well. We heard from a younger woman called Aishwarya Machani, who is works for the UN Foundation, which is one of the NGOs that was there. She's what's called a Next Generation Fellow. So she's got funding to do research and thinking. And she was thinking, about like the future from a young person's perspective. We then heard, and this was very important, Africa was represented by several officials from the African Union, the AU. And the first chap was the presiding officer, Khalid Boudali, I think he's Egyptian, who is the presiding officer of the African Union Economic, Social and Cultural Council, which is like ECOSOC is to the UN, he is to the African Union. And he said, look, we are really behind this. We want to get involved in this discussion about the future. And at the end of that panel, we heard from an amazing woman called Maria Fernanda Espinosa, who is co-chair of the body that was sponsoring, or one of the bodies that was organizing the event, which is called the Coalition for the UN We Need, which is a coalition of NGOs trying to design, redesign the UN, because it hasn't been able to prevent the wars that have been going on the planet. It hasn't solved economic problems. It hasn't solved, environmental problems. So what do we need to do to the UN? So that's what this group, Coalition for the UN We Need, was talking about. And she spoke brilliantly. She's also the executive director of a thing called Global Women Leaders, Voices for Change and Inclusion. And this was a strong streak running throughout the event of the importance of women's voices in all this. Right, so that was the beginning, and it was very well, orchestrated. By then we could hear everything clearly. It was all recorded, and this is available on I haven't got the actual links, but it is available in the public space somewhere. I'll find out. We then went into another panel after a brief break, hearing from some other NGO leaders. This was moderated, this next session, by a woman who is co-president of the Club of Rome, which is one of these think tanks, been going on for a long time. She's an impressive lady called Sandrine Dixon de Clèves. I think, some exotic French, Belgian, British mixture, I don't quite know what, but she was highly articulate and very intelligent. She chaired it very well. We heard from an African-American guy called Kizito Bienkia, who did a very interesting talk about theories of change. It was quite an academic thing. It'd be good to go and listen to it again. Like, what is change? Can we predict it? What are the levers that are propelling global change? How can we make sure it goes in the right direction? We then heard from a younger woman, Sophia Bermudez, who is part of the Global Futures Forum Youth Coordinator. She works with UNESCO's youth network. She was speaking about some youth projects going on around the world. Don't forget, in UN parlance, anyone up to 35 counts as youth. So, there's hope for lots of us. We then heard from an important guy called Jeffrey Hofenez, who was speaking about the regional aspect. It was important we heard voices from all over the world, the Pacific region, Asia, Africa, Europe, and so on. And he was saying, okay, so this is why, why that's important. Next, we heard from Soon Young Yoon, who is the UN representative of something called the International Alliance for Women. Again, she was talking about, women have a huge investment in the future, don't they? Just the fact that they give birth to us all, 9 months, and then horrendously difficult labor, they do all that because they believe in the future. They believe in their children and their and humanity as a project. My mother was a great believer in the future and a great supporter of the UN, I have to say. I was a kid brought up in a family where we got the UNESCO courier each month, things like that. So women have an investment in the future, and this woman was speaking about that. She spoke about a feminist framework for the whole project. Women are 50% of humanity, and they want a decent future for themselves and their descendants. And for men, of course, it's not like just women, it's men and women working together. We then heard from a very impressive guy, Dan Perel, who was the guy involved in really making things work, I discovered, who is the Baha'i representative at the UN. And he's co-chair of the Coalition for the UN We Need, very clever young man. He spoke about e-consultations and the digital future of humanity. We're able to talk to each other because we have digital means of communication now, which is great, but some people misuse those. And we know there's all kinds of cyber espionage and God knows what going on, and cyber misinformation. So the UN has made that an important track for the future. If we're going to have a future, we have to get a handle on a digital future that works for everybody. And he spoke well about that. And then we had an absolutely brilliant, I think at this point I felt at home now as an academic, when we heard from the Copenhagen Institute on Future Studies. I'd said in the chat about half an hour before, I said, has anyone invited anyone from Future Studies here? Because that's a branch closely related to peace studies. I've known Future Studies pioneers for years. Kenneth Boulding was an old friend of mine who's sadly dead now. And, you know, lo and behold, yes, they had. They invited the director of the Copenhagen Institute on Future Studies, a man called Jonas Gissel Mikkelsen, who spoke. This centre in Copenhagen has been pioneering future studies ever since the days of President Kennedy. They showed us a slide of the founder of the thing meeting Kennedy way back in the 60s. Future studies has been around since the late 50s, 60s, you know, and it's an academic field thinking how we can predict the future, plan for it, you know, resolve conflicts around the future, because there are many different voices on this planet. Not least religious voices, which claim to know the future. They have a sort of blueprint of how it's going to unfold. And there's a clash between different future epistemologies. You know, if you read particular religious texts, then it says this is going to happen, that's going to happen. If you're more of a scientific bent, then you will say, well, I don't know about that, but maybe this is going to happen, and so on. So this futures dimension is very important. Anyway, this guy spoke brilliantly. Brought along a UNESCO professor of future studies from Copenhagen as well. They produced a journal called Farsight, which is a journal of futures thinking, which I've got a copy of, I can send to anyone. It was brilliant. Then we had the respondent, who was the Jamaican permanent representative or ambassador to the UN, a brilliant, amazing guy called Brian Wallace. Obviously an intellectual, you know, he must have been something extremely interesting in Jamaica, which is a brilliant multicultural society. And he was just saying how important this meeting is, and please, everyone do your work well. Okay, now at that point, there was a little break for lunch or whatever. And then we split up into various working groups, as is typical in these kind of big conferences. And there were about 2,000 people online, I was told, and there were a couple of hundred in the venue itself live. We split into three groups. One was on human rights and participation. One was on environmental governance, and one was on UN and global governance innovation. I chose to go to the third one because of our commission on good global governance, right, which WIWF runs, and we've had meetings about that with Nicholas Hagger, so I thought I ought to go to that. And it didn't disappoint, you know, it was really interesting. I listened, I took copious notes, I heard different people speaking, and these were, you know, NGO leaders, but really the experts of the planet who've been thinking about this stuff for the last decades, including some younger ones like Dan Perel and so on. One of the things they were saying, which they're really quite strong on, is that they wanted a UN Parliamentary Assembly to be created as a result of this process. That's their main proposal that they're going to put forward to the UN, saying, look, we the people want a parliamentary assembly. So some of the discussion was devoted to that. Now that's exactly what WIWF has called for. That's what Nicholas Hagger wants, exactly, a UN Parliamentary Assembly. So we discussed things like, well, how would it be elected? One, and their idea, which I think is a good one, is that there would be two representatives from each nation on the earth, one representing the government and one representing the opposition. So in Britain, you know, you'd have the Conservatives would send a rep and then Labour would send a rep. They'd both be equal representatives. That would build in some democracy. I raised the question, well, what do you do with one-party states like China or Russia, actually, where actually there isn't an opposition permitted? That wasn't addressed. There's, you know, I mean, that design needs future thinking. Okay, what do we do in the case of or Belarus, where the opposition was disqualified from winning the election and the leader had to flee the country. You know, what do you do in those kind of places? So there's some thinking needed on that. But as a concept, a UN Parliamentary Assembly is brilliant. We also discussed where it should be located. And somebody said in chat, who was African, said, why not in Africa? Because they don't really have, you know, significant UN bodies. And there's a new building going up in Kenya, apparently, which is being built as we speak, a huge complex, which could host and house this UN Parliamentary Assembly. So I said, yes, that's a good idea. Why not put it in Africa? You know, it would be a good idea. And maybe it could have, like, occasionally meet in New York at the General Assembly and occasionally meet in Geneva. So that way it'd cover Africa, America, and Europe. Anyway, that was a brilliant session. We then came back from lunch, and I should say at that point, then we broke into other working groups, right? And the 4 next working groups were peace and security, development, global economic and financial architecture reform, and the global digital compact. Like, are we going to change the way the world does its internet stuff and shares out knowledge? All of which are incredibly important, obviously. I would have liked to go to all of them. My friend from Scotland, our wife coordinator in Scotland, Morag Fairley, actually appeared. So I left her in one, and she went to the peace and security one. And then I was able to pop into the global digital compact session as well. So I kind of did both. I did the peace and security one. And there were some absolutely brilliant ideas. This was coordinated by an old friend of mine called Alan Ware, who lives in New Zealand. And he you know, had tabled about 10 specific peace-related proposals, which were very good. I'll come to them a bit later. Kanu, welcome. I think Kanu's wondering. So this is just an introductory talk I'm doing, Kanu, about this meeting that took place in the UN on the Global Summit for a Future. And then, you know, I'm going through what happened on the event, and then I'm going to be making a few bullet points, and then we'll have questions, discussion, and so on. So I hope you're enjoying it. Right, and I did mention in the Global Digital Compact Forum, I said that we had already proposed a cyber peace treaty, like a few years back. And, you know, people thought, oh, that's interesting. So I was putting stuff into chat, which got people responding and interested. Okay, next we broke into roundtables, where we kind of did feedback and general discussion from each of the different working groups. And I went between the peace one and the global governance one, which seemed appropriate, taking lots of notes. That evening, there was like a social event, which I couldn't go to, a real one, with on the theme of women and water. Water's been a big theme at the UN this year. There's been a World Summit of Water and all kinds of things. One of the ideas I saw, actually, somebody's proposed there should be a parliament of rivers, let alone a parliament of, like for the UN. Why not have a parliament of rivers? So the River Hudson would be represented in the Parliament of Rivers. The River Nile would be represented. The River Danube, the River Ganges, the Shannon, the Thames, which would get people out of their national boxes. It would get them thinking in a more holistic, environmentally friendly and joined up way. And water is sacred in all the world's religions, you know. As a Druid, you know, we love water, and we do our ceremonies by lakes, rivers and wells. So I thought this idea of a parliament of rivers was a brilliant one. Okay, Then it was the second day. So that was the first day, right? Day two began with a poem. I missed it, unfortunately, from an African poet called Karimot Odebode. And she's the founder of Black Girl's Dream. I wish I didn't hear the poem because I couldn't get connected in time. We then heard this theme was called the intergenerational responsibilities. So this was for young people and old people to work together in redesigning the world, which is important, And we heard from Anya Olin Pape, who's the chair of the Council of Europe, Council on Youth, and head of strategy at Global Challenges Foundation. I think she was Swedish, actually, a very impressive speaker. We then heard from an amazing woman who I think is based possibly the Philippines, somewhere in that part of the world, Kekasha, or Indonesia possibly, Kekashan Basu, who's the founder president of something called the Green Hope Foundation. This is an NGO that's doing actual environmental work on the ground in different parts, particularly of East Asia and Indonesia, Malaysia and places. And I was incredibly impressed. There is hope for the planet with people like this about. They're raising money and they're doing grassroots type of work. And we heard from Maria João Rodrigues, a Portuguese, who's the foundation for president of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, and has been a member of the European Parliament for many years. She was a very articulate speaker and highly intelligent. And she had a lot of useful things to point out about intergenerational co-working. Okay, after a break, we went into the regional panel where speakers spoke from different parts of the world. We heard from, the moderator was from Nigeria, from the Nigerian network of NGOs, Oyebisi Babatunde. We heard from Asia, our Asian representative, Anselmo Lee, I think was from, not exactly sure, possibly Philippines. The Pacific region spoke, addressed by Jackie Cabasso. The Pacific is the whole Pacific region. So she's from the Western US, but that counts. Japan, China, etc. We heard a very moving speech from the Latin American representative, a chap called Javier Suraski. Now, he had something rather sad to say, to be honest. He said in the course of his point that on average per year, about 1,500 social activists, that's his term for it, are being assassinated and killed throughout Latin America. They're being shot, disappeared, or whatever. And these are trade union leaders, intellectuals, teachers, activists, human rights workers, church leaders, whatever. Anyone that annoys the government, really, with asking too much can be got rid of. And about 1,500 of them are dying every year. Like he said, how can we, oh man, I mean, people are just afraid, aren't they, in that climate to do social activism. And that would include peace activism, human rights activism, and gender activism, and so on. So that was a sobering message from him. We then heard from our Europe representative, a Greek guy called Georgios Kostakos, who spoke very well. He's involved in something called the Foundation for Global Governance and Sustainability. And he spoke for about 10 minutes. I have to say, I was a bit disappointed that in his speech, he didn't once mention the Ukraine war. I listened very carefully. I thought, what? Like the biggest threat to Europe, the greatest war going on in our part of the world. And this guy, who's our European rep, doesn't even mention it. So I put my hand up and got a question in. And I said, look, what's going on here, Yorgos? Why didn't you mention the Ukraine war? To which I got a response. I got a couple of responses, one of the key people said, oh, yes, okay, yeah, but it's not the only war going on in the world. Why should we mention that one? And I pointed out that's not really an acceptable logic. I mean, you don't, if you're a doctor and somebody is saying, why aren't you treating that patient with their arms blown off and they're, you know, dying down in, you don't say, well, I'm not treating them because there are loads of other people that are dying as well. You know, why should I bother? No, we have to treat them all. Anyway, I made my point that certainly the World Intellectual Wisdom Forum, we have a Ukrainian rep on our committee, and you know, it's a tragedy. So I made the point, and I was a bit shocked that the European guy didn't even mention it. We then heard from Africa, and again, it was from the African Union ECOSOC. This time, the head of secretariat spoke brilliantly. Right, so then we went back into our working groups again. I joined the peace and security one, and I'll come in my bullet points to some of the points raised. And then after lunch, we went into the last sort of afternoon session of this. And there was a report backs from the working groups to the plenary, right? So this is for you that have been to UN type stuff. It's standard practice. You work in separate tracks and then you report back. So each of these working groups, the Global Governance Innovation one, reported back and actually mentioned my idea of putting the World Parliament in Africa. So that was a plus. And what was nice about this is we got to hear what all the other working groups had been discussing. I'd only been to three, the peace one and the digital compact, and then the global governance one. But so I was able to hear, for instance, the human rights one had been very busy and doing a lot of important work. So had the environmental governance one. And we were thinking, gosh, this is like really important. Each time one of these groups reported back, we thought, God, these are amazing suggestions. And they had normally a high-level diplomat or UN person on the panel, like doing some feedback as these guys reported. People from Brazil, from India. There was an amazing guy, Dr. Arun Nabha Ghosh, who's from the Council on Energy, Environment and Water in India. They had a chap called David Passarelli, who's on the Centre for Policy Research at the UN University. And he's a member of the Secretariat for the Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board for Effective Multilateralism, which is a think tank that he's set up, which is working in parallel to what we were doing. So the level of discussion was very, high level, and it was brilliant. Okay, finally, there was a vote of thanks and a sort of closing session with some of the key players. Now, if you've been around the world governance work for a long time, you'll have heard of a chap called Fergus Watt, who's a Canadian. He spoke brilliantly about, the process. He was doing the vote of thanks, essentially. He's coordinator of the Coalition for the UN We Need, which had been organizing the event. We heard from an amazing woman in the Philippines called Becky Malay from the Global Call to Action Against Poverty. Because one of the tracks is about financial restructuring and ending poverty. And, she's part of an international coalition of hundreds of thousands of people working on this at grassroots level. And she spoke about that. Right, so that was the event, okay. And it was extremely good. And the next day, there was what they call the UN Missions Engagement Day. So people went out as volunteers to meet with various UN missions, Ireland, Sweden, Nigeria, and so on. I'm not sure the total list, but quite a few who were going to receive them and talk politely and say, yes, we're with you. Right, that was the event. And it was brilliant. Now I'm going to come to the second part of this talk. I'm just going to run through the bullet points that I want to comment on. And then I'll hand over and we can have discussion and questions and so on. Right, so the first thing I want to say is that there is a big overlap between what this day was doing and indeed what the UN is trying to do with the Summit of the Future, and what we as the World Intellectual Wisdom Forum have been trying to do with our Global Commission on Global Good Governance. So the UN obviously was talking about UN and global governance innovation, which fits with our idea of a supranational authority. And I did raise in that track, I raised a couple of times, I said, look, you guys are great, I love you, and you want a parliamentary assembly for the UN, that's all lovely. But actually, you won't actually be able to do much, will you, until we get a supranational authority in place. And that's what we're campaigning for, Nicholas Hagger's proposal, because only that will have teeth and strength to actually do something. So that was listened to, it was heard. They didn't shoot me, as it were. Exact overlap between our proposal, or Nicholas's proposal, for a global economic infrastructure reform. He says that's one of the 7 areas that the supranational authority should take charge of. Well, that's what the UN was debating. And I'm sad I didn't have time to sit in on that panel discussing global economic and financial architecture. Listening to their feedback, they were talking about what we do with the World Bank, the IMF. How do we stop? Okay, about half the nations of the world are in debt. The small nations, the little nations, the Jamaicas, the Vanuatu, they're in debt. They can't afford hardly to pay their own workers' bills. And they're having to service that debt. To whom? Well, to the global banking industry, essentially. So a thought that came to me, quite a radical thought, is, and I hadn't gone to the meetings, but I was thinking, what would Keynes say, who's an economist I greatly respect, British economist who was there when they founded the World Bank? I think he'd say 2 things. He'd say, cancel all world debt, like write this off. These small nations shouldn't have to have the burden of paying this debt to the international financial capitalist structures, right? Just cancel it. And secondly, I think there should be a global currency. Just as the EU introduced the euro, which works very well, and it simplifies everything, and people don't have to pay, get money changed when they go to a different country. If we had a global currency, say that, if I go to Jamaica or China or India, it's the same thing, like a global euro. Anyway, I suggested that. What's wrong with that? Let's think big, right? We also are the same. We're campaigning for global ecological and environmental governance, which is what this section was doing. Now, what wasn't there? Okay, we're proposing that health should be part of the global governance structure and supranational thing. It wasn't really discussed here. I don't know why, given the pandemic, given the huge medical bills people are facing. I've read a report, like huge numbers of people can't afford healthcare. It's become so technologically sophisticated, they can't afford it. There's something wrong with the global healthcare system, and that wasn't discussed. So that's a, slap on the wrist, I think. Second thing that wasn't really discussed, and I kept asking in chat, why not, was education, which to me as a teacher and a professor and educator, that is the solution to all these problems. There was nobody from UNESCO. Now, I was told by the organizers in chat, oh, Thomas, UNESCO had its own conference. But I don't think that's good enough. I think UNESCO should have been represented at this meeting at a high level. It just had the end of last year, a big conference on transforming education. And it is a track within the UN Summit of the Future. But why weren't they present talking to us? I think that was silly, to be honest. I suppose their idea of a global digital compact would fall within the education remit of UNESCO, which is United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. So it would come within that. But I just was disappointed. I mean, I think the Secretary General of UNESCO should have been there. If I was the Secretary General of UNESCO, I would have been there and saying we're committed to this. The next thing that wasn't really discussed, and maybe from our point of view, the most important, was the question of faith, religion, spirituality, and culture. Complete silence about this. And yet it's one of the 7 areas that we are saying a supranational body should have some kind of role in, like moderating the views of extremist religious groups and trying to work with moderate intellectuals active within each of the religions, not so that religion doesn't become weaponized. What we're trying to do as the World Intellectual Wisdom Forum is appeal to the rational, advanced thinkers within each faith, whether Jain or Hindu or Buddhist or Christian or whatever, and get dialogue going between them, rather than leaving it to extremists to voice their extremist concerns. And I think the UN just is, I don't know, maybe it's not intellectually equipped to deal with this issue. Maybe it's afraid of it because it thinks religion is dangerous and therefore can't touch it. I don't know. We can discuss that when we come to the discussion. But I'm just saying it wasn't on the agenda, right? What was on the agenda was brilliant, was the peace proposals, right? One thing that they proposed was a United Nations Emergency Peace Service, UNEPS. There should be a standing force organized by the UN, like a peacekeeping force, ready to go into action at a moment's notice. And there was a particular guy who was promoting this idea, which I think is brilliant. So that would help Gutierres with ARTSAC and the problem of what do you do when people start, causing trouble in different parts of the world. Well, you'd send in UNEPS, the UN Emergency Peace Force. It would have helped in the Ukraine thing, I suppose, when the invasion happened. Presumably UNEPS would have gone in to stop the Russian tanks. I don't know. Thoughts need to be articulated on how it would work. I think one of the most shocking things that I learned, I sort of knew it already, but it was repeated, is the budget issue here of the spending on peace. The total military budget of the world last year was $2.3 trillion, which is $2,300 billion. That's what the world spends on weapons, militarism and military intelligence, right? The entire UN budget for everything is $3 billion, which is nothing. I mean, no wonder the UN can't solve these problems. And one of the most important propositions put forward by the peace group was we should revisit Article 26 of the UN Charter, right? Which I happen to have here in front of me in my little book of peace declarations, which I produced for Dr. S.L. Gandhi. You may recall that. His 85th birthday. Article 26 says, in order to promote the establishment and maintenance of international peace and security, with the least diversion for armaments of the world's human and economic resources, the Security Council shall be responsible for formulating plans to be submitted to the members of the UN for the establishment of a system for the regulation of armaments. It's not been done, And one of the things the peace people were saying is let's reactivate Article 26. It should be done. And let's get this military spending down so that the peace forces of the planet can get properly funded. Oh, and just to contrast, by the way, the New York Police Department has a budget of $5 billion a year. Just the New York Police Department, whereas the entire UN budget is $3 billion. That's what we're up against. What if the world wants a future, it's got to stop investing in armaments and start investing in, in peace. I will say there is sort of light at the end of the tunnel. The world education budget is $5 trillion a year. So you might think, oh, well, that's good. At least we're spending more on education than on the military. But only 6% of that budget goes to low-income countries. 66% of it is spent in the very richest countries to send kids to Oxford and Harvard, right? And the balance is in middle-income countries. So there's a problem with the dysfunctionality of the global education spending, and that should be addressed in the education track of this process. But poor old UNESCO.
Gaps in education.
Yeah, UNESCO doesn't have hardly the budget to even do the thinking that's needed. So that, you know, we have to do it for them as noble volunteers from the world's intellectual community. And also, I think essential is a global arms peace tax. So all arms deals should be taxed like 50%. I think that should go to the UN. If I sell rockets to some country around the world, I should, you know, there should be a tax on that. That wasn't discussed as such. I also think there should be peace studies in every university on the planet. By law, that wasn't discussed because UNESCO weren't there. And I think there should be peace education in all schools. Again, it wasn't discussed, but I know that New Zealand has implemented that thanks to the efforts of Alan Ware. And Fergus Watt at the end of the event said he should get the gold medal for the best organized track, the peace track. Okay, so I talked about the future studies input. That was great. We have a chap, Shlomo Soham, who's written this book called Future Intelligence. And he's an ombudsman for the future, for the Israeli government. And the Israeli government's going through a meltdown, as we know, as we speak. I think Shlomo should be talking to them about, like, you know, future intelligence, planning ahead. Because that's really what's at stake here. Is the world going to have a future? Only if we can activate our future intelligence thinking. The other point I've made already, just to repeat, you know, the war wasn't mentioned, the Ukraine war. And I think that's a lacuna. It shows up a problem with the UN, which of course, Russia is still a member of the Security Council, influential power. The UN structure was designed without thinking that one member of the Security Council would start attacking other members. There's no real mechanism in place for that. So how can the UN restructure so that that kind of thing is ruled out? And what can we do about that? Another thing that wasn't discussed is, although it may have been in the financial architectural reform thing, was the question of political corruption, the way that politics has become so corrupt. I've seen this in the UK. You can buy governments these days through manipulation of social media. You can do things like Brexit. You can create the Trump phenomena. You can create the Netanyahu phenomena. You can weaponize thought itself if you have enough money. And this is something that the designers of the UN never foresaw. So what can we do about that? My response to this, I didn't get to say it because I wasn't speaking at the thing officially, is that all politicians worldwide should take a truth oath. I swear by Almighty God, or whatever I call the Supreme Spirit, to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in my office as an MP or member of the House of Lords or whatever. And if I don't, I get sacked. This, I think, would take care of it all. So I think that should be on the agenda, because what's the point of creating a parliamentary assembly for the UN if they're all lying? It's just another structure for liars to do their thing and be corrupt, you know. And then, so what about the global faiths stuff that was not mentioned? Why is it important? Well, colleagues will know this is my particular thing. I'm a teacher of philosophy and comparative religion. And although there were Baha'is and Christians and Muslims and others present at this meeting, it wasn't on the agenda. Now, I think that's silly. We need to put it on the agenda for the UN for world reform, but in an intelligent and well thought out way. For instance, faith is part of the disputes going on the planet. In many of the wars going on, you know, one army believes in one thing, another army believes in another. It's part of the complex issues in Kashmir. It's part of the issues in the Middle East. It was very much part of the Balkans. The Kosovo thing is still not solved. You know, it's part of conflict all over the world. So why isn't the UN addressing that? I think that needs changing. I set up in the 90s, late 90s, the only multi-faith, multicultural mediation service which deals with interfaith dispute resolution. It's the only one. Why? You know, I want that to get UN recognition so that we're sent into conflict zones where faith is part of the problem, and and we would take in the best trained, qualified theologians from both parties, right, who would then be able to mediate and calm things down. You know, I mean, India has become a basket case recently with the Hinduization of different factions who then attack Islam as Islam, you know, and make death threats against them, and also against Christians. It's going on in India. And this is totally antithetical to everything that the India I believe in stands for. So that would be where the mediation service could be involved. The UN talks a lot about peace building, but I think this spiritual track should be part of proactive peace building. You can calm people down with some proper education in these matters. And therefore, my proposal would be on this track that every school on the planet should have proper philosophical and religious education as part of its curriculum. Okay, not just a one-track education like in Afghanistan or other countries. No, but a proper, comprehensive and universal scientifically based education in morality, ethics, philosophy, and spirituality and religious studies. You know, this should be every child's birthright, in my view. And also, therefore, I'm proposing it could use as its foundation my periodic table, which some of you, if you haven't come across it, this is the most comprehensive design pedagogical tool. It's like Mendeleev's table of the chemical elements. It articulates and lists all the different denominations of religions and philosophies, everything from Hegelianism to logical positivism to Rudolf Steiner's traditions to Christian Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, you know, all the different schools of Judaism and Islam and Jainism and Sikhism and so on and so on. This should be on every classroom around the planet. And I think the UN and UNESCO should endorse this and say, yes, we, the ministers of education, agree. The other thing that we could do and insist on is the Interfaith Peace Treaty, which some people haven't signed, but many religious and intellectual leaders around the planet have signed it. It's got its own website. Again, I think, you see, if you're going to be an interfaith leader or a faith leader, if you're going to call yourself an imam or a rabbi or a priest, you have to have a care for the other, which is, you know, the other guy's religion. I don't think it's the duty of faith leaders in this world of interdependence, a small planet, to see one's duty as whipping up a rabble against the other guys, you know, even within your own denomination. So Putin is being terribly badly advised by his patriarch, Kirill, that it's fine, he can go and kill Ukrainians because they're Untermenschen. You know, this is just anti-religious nonsense. So interfaith peace treaty should be, I think, obligatory for signing by all rabbis, imams, pastors, and chaplains around the planet. And UNESCO and the UN should promote it and run courses and so on. Okay, next, last but one point. So what is the role of our work, the World Intellectual Wisdom Forum, in all this? Well, I think we should work with this process. We should support it. I was pleased to be there. We should particularly support UNESCO and the role of intellectuals in this process and try and get them more active and support the education transformation that they're calling for. We can promote the idea of education aid, which for those that don't know, it's my solution to global shortage of funds for education, which is to have one day off a year everywhere on the planet. All schools and universities have a free day, Education Aid Day, and they do fundraising events in the institution, so in the school or university, and all the money raised goes to education. It's a simple idea, and if it was endorsed by UNESCO and UN, it would happen if they agreed at a ministerial level. The same day every year on the planet, and then it was sponsored by the media. And my last point is about polarization, which is what we're suffering from as a planet. Again, because there was no real track for metaphysics or philosophy or thinking, the UN is too much focused on process, in my critique. It doesn't do the deep thinking that's needed. Philosophers don't, get a look in. I think the Secretary General knows that, and that's why he's reached out. This concept of multilateralism, which they use, I mean, what does that actually mean? I've coined the opposite word to this, which I call monologism. Monologism says there's one answer to everything, and I know it, and you better do it or I'll shoot you. Monologism you find in extreme nationalisms, you find it in extreme ideologies. Some religions promote monologism, the idea of there's only one truth and our religion or our faith has it. And some political movements are the same. The Bolsheviks were like that, the Nazis and so on. So that's monologism, which is dangerous. Putin is a monologist, so is Netanyahu. So was Boris Johnson and Brexit. The only answer is Brexit, It's fake stuff. Against that, the UN says, no, multilateralism. But we need to think that through. What does that mean? There's a plurality of truths. There's a plurality of solutions. We all have our own bit to contribute. Let's do it together. That's what multilateralism means. But philosophically, I think what it means is the ending of polarization, because polarization happens when you get two monologists in conflict. One faction, Party A, says, I'm the truth, the light, and the way, and it's this way or the highway. And the other guy says the total opposite. No, it's my way. This is monologism in battle. If we have multilateralism, we can go to the Jain insight of Anikant Vada, which is there are many truths. No tradition has a monopoly of all the truths. No one intellectual can master all the truths. It's just we therefore have to work together in humility. So I would say we need some Anikant Vada married up with agape, which is the Western insight of love, spiritual love, platonic love. If we can combine Anikant Vada with agape, it means I accept you as you are, whatever your color, or your creed, or your politics. And combine that with epoche, which is the Western idea of suspension of judgment. Let's be humble on this planet. And gradually these monological, weaponized, polarized dialogues might begin to die down. So anyway, those are my bullet points I wanted to share with you. I hope you found that interesting and insightful. So now over to questions, discussion, comments, anything. Put your hand up in you know how to do that, the reactions button, and then let's have a discussion.
It was really very insightful discussion or talk, Thomas.
Thank you.
Gave a lot of insight, a lot of positive things were there, a lot of missing things were also there, especially education, health was not covered. The idea of peace was not covered. And
no, peace was covered. Peace was covered, of course. Yeah. But you're right, health and education worked. Yeah.
Yeah, health and education was missing. That was a major factor because education is one field that can only solve most of the issues in all the areas. So that was the thing. But idea of taking these three topics into consideration, like youth, then interconnectivity between youth and the seniors, and then the third part was the women. That was, and the idea that you said that the women and water, that sounds great.
Yeah, that's what that. You know, I mean, it was very well thought out. They were doing a good job within the resources they had.
Yeah.
And it's up to us, the public, the intelligentsia, to, you know, to make suggestions or for extra things they can.
Peace was covered. Yeah, I recalled it. Peace was covered, but the budget for peace was very less. That was the point of concern. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that is a global
much required everywhere. The budget for that is a minimal. That is strange. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Anybody, please?
Okay. Any other questions? Any other points? George, what do you want to say in response?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Thomas, for this comprehensive, really summary of what transpired, happened in the Summit for the Future event or conference, which actually I attended very few minutes, the opening session. And very, very impressive, of course, in terms of the organization, also in terms of the people who are actually in the call and the speakers, etc. And I wish that I could actually, you know, follow up, you know, throughout the time, but I couldn't make it. Of course, I saw you, and I was, of course, also delighted to see you there.
Right, I remember you turning up. Yeah,
that's right. And so I could see, of course, a lot of similarity with what we are trying to promote here and discuss in the WIF, so I thought that I still hope that the ideas we have, you know, that could be kind of, you know, married, as it were, with what they are planning and add to the missing links, the missing ideas. So I'm really very happy with your analysis and the commitment you have really in all these and putting all these ideas together. That's really impressive to me. So thank you very much.
It's our duty, isn't it? I've coined a word in the last couple of weeks. I'm writing a dictionary of new words. I've got a new word. It's called the unintelligentsia, which is the opposite of the intelligentsia. We're the intelligentsia. There's this thing, the unintelligentsia, who dominate a lot of media discussions and politics and so on. And they operate on binary polarization and on disinformation, on lies. What I liked about this meeting, it was a meeting of the global intelligentsia. Proper intellectuals were there, and it was a pleasure to be with them. I just want to say that quite a few people from Africa came, attended, and there was a professor from East Africa who is importantly involved with something called the World Society for Victimology. I think she's a professor of law in a university somewhere in East Africa, and she wants to get the World Intellectual Wisdom Forum spread more in East Africa, particularly among young intellectuals. I will give you her email, put you in touch with her. She's Professor Sarah Akanle or something. I'll put you in touch. And and also we have with us Ponle Akande from Nigeria. Would you like to comment, Ponle, on what you heard? I know you came in a bit late, but I was doing a report back. Ponle is very active in Nigeria, I think. If you unmute, we can hear your points. You might be having trouble.
Thomas, you please share the connects of youth and women with me so that we can send them invite for that Agent of Change project.
Yes, I will share all the details that I've got with you. No problem.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay. Sean, do you want to comment? Oh, did I mention, I think I forgot, that the permanent ambassador from Ireland spoke at this event. And he was pretty impressive. He was on the panel. Let me try and find his name. It was good to see Ireland represented at this level. So, yeah, I can't remember his name right now, but
yeah, if you get his name, thanks, Thomas. Again, I'm not sure what my response being. You've covered such the conference covered such a broad area. I think the economics thing is very important. I know, like in Europe, in the crisis, Europe did something that had never done before. It gave out money. It created money out of nothing. The European Central Bank. It did something every banker in the world had said up to then was not possible to do during the crisis in the last few years. The European Central Bank it was almost like forgiving debt. It would be that sort of dramatic. So hopefully we can learn from what happened in Europe that the world banking will have to change. But the fundamentals of it will have to change if we are going to get to a future for all the people who are deprived of the bare, the necessities of life, of education, of food, of shelter, and of peace as well, of course. So that's just my initial response. And Thomas, thanks very much for such a broad. I did mean to try and get into that some of the sessions, but I didn't. So thanks for the report you made.
Can I just ask you, Sean, in your books, you've written several books about redesigning the world and the future of the planet. Have you addressed this issue of economic restructuring and financial reform and so on?
Well, not specifically, because it's not an area that I would be an expert in, but I'm just saying what actually happened in Europe was an amazing and it happened, I don't know whether it was planned or not, but the banks did something that they never thought. The international bank, the main banks did something that the banking theory had said would not be possible or would create disaster. So the idea of cancelling the debt of the poor of all the countries, they would say, oh, that's going to create disaster, but it may not actually. That was the point I was making there.
Yeah.
So I think we are moving towards, because in the last book I did, I'm calling it, we are moving towards the first global techno-scientific civilization on the planet. It's never happened before. So we're living in exciting times, I suppose, and some of that drive is technological and scientific. But it's running away with us because they are not bringing in things like religion and spiritual well-being, as you say, on that conference. And it's so important to have that as a foundation. Because from my point of view, I think it is a major missed opportunity, but maybe we can do that. I mean, I don't want to keep too long, but we say the UNESCO is one of the world's kind of peace organizations settled down to the United Nations, but its basic philosophy says this: since wars begin in the minds of men, it's in the minds of men that defenses for peace must be built. Now, that's a good logical argument, but I'd say that's wrong. Wars begin in the hearts of men, in the spirits of men. Wars are fought by the minds of men and women, but the wars begin in the heart. So if we're just doing the mind bit and we're missing the spiritual and the heart bit, the whole structure is not going to move forward. So that's my little contribution. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I mean, UNESCO's up the road from me in Paris. I don't know what we can do to get them more engaged with this, but I'll be doing my best. I'd like to inform you that in the French constitution of UNESCO, it says les guerres commencent dans l'esprit des hommes. The French word for this is l'esprit des hommes, which we translate as the minds of men, but actually it should be the spirits of men. So the French language is more subtle and nuanced in some respects than the English. The English is very good at splitting things up and mind is here and spirit's there and heart's there. The French word l'esprit des hommes includes all three, right? So I don't think that the French intellectuals on the whole do understand this. But I think the problem with UNESCO is it's become a bit too bureaucratic. I mean, we at the World Intellectual Wisdom Forum, we met in UNESCO headquarters at one of our meetings in Europe. I think, Gevork, you came with me, didn't you, to the UNESCO headquarters? And we had some other colleagues that came. Gevork came from Armenia. And we spent a nice time in the library, which is a great resource for people. But I'd like to see, anyway, I'm going to keep battering on the doors of UNESCO and see what they can do. They think in nationalistic terms. And I don't think intellectuals belong to nations. I think we belong to the world. You know, and yes, we happen to have a passport. We need that. We have a national identity. I have at least 3 national identities, maybe more, you know. But I think a true intellectual belongs to the whole of humanity. And therefore, I don't think UNESCO in its current nationalistic setup is sensitive enough to that. It all moves at the slowest pace of the slowest nation. And that's, you know, that needs reform. So let's put our thinking caps on and see what we can do about UNESCO reform as well. But those are good points. Thank you very much. Samantha, what do you think? You're a free spirit. You're an internationalist. Do you wish you'd attended the meeting?
No, I very much appreciate your synopsis. I feel slightly overwhelmed in a way by the amount of information. And what often happens with me when I'm overwhelmed by the amount of information is there's a need to sort of isolate and process. And by process, I mean really discern within myself what feels of value. And I don't mean that in the sense of what feels egoically of value, but what feels spiritually of value in terms of the essence of who I am and the essence of who we all are, which is transcendent of anything we're even talking about. And so I can't say I have a particular piece of information to articulate at the moment, except I really liked, actually, Thomas, when you brought in your periodic table of philosophical elements. That kind of got me thinking about the periodic table of elements in general, and how when you look at that and when you think about it, what is it really saying? What is it really saying on a very deep, transcendent level? There are these elements which are related to our physical world, but what it's pointing to on a deeper level is that it's all one and the same thing. It's all a multitude of different aspects that all lead and point back to one thing. And we could say the same thing about all this philosophical sort of spiritual elements. What do they all point back to? What is the one commonality of all of them? And it's that there is a source authority bigger than the human ego. And that's not at all to disparage the human ego. I love the human ego. But one other thing I thought of while you were talking is that when we talk about infrastructure, whether it's on a national level, a state level, an individual level, our own infrastructures, what that says is it talks to the past, because like Sean was saying, everything that we see in the physical world, even this, came from an idea that was then put into process, that was then put into reality. And so even though it's in my present, it represents the past. And so in infrastructure, all of our institutions, all of our infrastructures are based on ideas from the past. So how can we build an infrastructure that is so far outlandish at this point that it seems ridiculous? And you use the word radical, but perhaps that's actually where we need to look, is so far in the future. And where is that going to be based? That's going to be based in our essence, the essence again of who we are, which is trusting, which is patient, which is grateful, and which is loving and collaborative. So you pointed towards a lot of wonderful things that are happening, and I have absolutely no doubt that they will continue to happen and things will take shape just the way that they're meant to.
Well, thank you very much, Samantha, for those wise words. I agree with you about the table, the importance of that. And I just would like to comment, because a lot of thinking went into it. So what I discovered, if you study chemistry or physics, and every school kid has to learn the periodic table of the elements, right, to some degree, our bodies and are really complex organisms, and we have within us all the elements. I'm made of carbon, hydrogen, all the metals, you know, even the subtle trace elements and so on. If you analyze a human body, we have all the elements within us, even tiny little bits of uranium and stuff like that. And they coexist in creating life. That's what life is. We're advanced, complex life forms. So we have all these things. A tree has the same. I have this great book on trees in French on my desk. I'm reading a bit from every morning. They're unbelievably complicated. How they take stuff out of the soil, how they photosynthesize light. They have all these elements within them. That's what makes life possible. Now, if one element in me said, I'm going to declare war on carbon, I'm hydrogen, I'm taking over. From now on, it's just hydrogen, carbon, go. You know, I die. And I'm arguing that it's the same with our spiritual elements. All of these traditions, which include the old shamanic traditions, you know, Finno-Ugric, Mongolian shamanism, Siberian, all the way down to the most sophisticated sort of modern, high technology, intellectual stuff. They're all like intellectual elements of the noosphere, to use Teilhard de Chardin's phrase. We all are made up of bits of them. You know, some of us in different proportions, like my Muslim friends will be much more, you know, versed in the green boxes. They'll know the ins and outs of whichever branch of Islam they're involved with. With any hope, they'll have listened to my commentary on the Quran and really be into that. Others will be more into the Jewish traditions down here. But actually, there's bits of trace elements of all of them jumbled up. You know, you can't be a rabbi without having explored Philo, who was deeply steeped in Plato, who came from the ancient Greek, prehistoric Bronze Age culture of European Old Europe, as Maria Gimbutas called it, and so on, the goddess traditions. So what I'm saying is that within all of us are all these elements. And what we've got going on in the world at the moment is wars between these different elements, which is as stupid as hydrogen declaring war on carbon inside our bodies. So that's the overall thinking. So thanks for, you know, highlighting that, Samantha. That's why I want this in every school and university worldwide, because it would raise the intellectual climate of intelligence quotient. Because, you know, the thinking is, oh, I don't like religion, it causes all the wars, so I don't want to know about it. You know, well, okay, there's a box here, there's all this row of humanist traditions, things like atheism or agnosticism or different forms of humanism. That's another valid thing, and we all have a bit of that in us too. So let's study them all, is what I'm saying, as educators. Let's teach them all. And to me, that's true universalism. One thing Nicholas Hagger says, who's co-chair of our Commission on Global Good Governance, he calls himself a universalist philosopher. So like me, he wants the best bits of all of these to work together in harmony. You know, so that to me is what the United Nations should stand for. And it does say in the opening, in the Charter of the UN, it says, we the peoples of the world, not we the nations. which is, you know, it's our body, this thing. I once chaired a meeting in, when I went to the World Conference on Religion and Peace in Italy, back in the 90s, when I was doing interfaith peace diplomacy. The then World Congress, there were 900 religious leaders from all over the planet, every faith. And I was asked to chair a meeting for how could the faith traditions do peace work better? That's what gave me the idea for the mediation service, right? There was a woman in the audience, an old Jewish lady of 90-something, who said she'd been in the lobbying groups in the 1930s and 40s, pressurizing Roosevelt when the UN was set up to have that phrase, we the peoples, because originally it was going to be we the nations of the world, blah, blah, blah. But they were saying, no, it should be the peoples. And I was honored that she was in that meeting, this woman, you know. And we should sort of, you know, not be afraid to use our power for good. Right, any last points? I'll finish at past, if that's okay. Gevorg, do you have any final thoughts? Can you tell me something I read in the papers recently? What's going on between Armenia and Russia? Is Russia rattling sabers at Armenia? What's that story about?
Thomas, thank you for your presentation.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go for it, yeah.
You ask about what is happening now among Armenia and Russia.
Yeah.
Armenia has started a process to ratify the statute of the International Criminal Court. And as you know, the court issued the order to arrest Putin.
Yes.
And now, if Armenia ratified, then Armenia will be obliged to arrest Putin if he comes to Armenia. And
right.
then it's a very interesting situation now. And
and he was issuing threats, wasn't he? He said, if you do that, we're going to be very cross. Did he make any specific threats to Armenia if you ratify the treaty?
Hello?
I mean, I hope he's not going to invade.
It's difficult to say what steps will undertake Russia. They have many instruments to influence to Armenia. They can just stop the gas supply, and they can pressure highly on Armenia. This would be very dangerous situation.
Sure.
They can also in Karabakh, they can make the situation more difficult for Armenians, and donate more lands to Azerbaijan as they do now. And Artsakh is now in blockade more than 100 days already. And so-called peacekeepers do nothing to open the only road. So
things are difficult, yeah. Thank you. I'd heard that was that was in my mind to raise that issue because I saw this threat from Russia. If you ratify, and you're a legal expert, you're a human rights expert. So I'm grateful on behalf of the International Criminal Court. I think it's very important that Putin should be brought to account. And it's very brave of Armenia to take that stand. So congratulations to you, a small country. I noted that some Russian crazy people said they would send a missile at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. That was their response to Holland. They're gonna blow up the court, which is just shocking. And we're dealing with crazy people really in Russia. And that's my final point before we finish the meeting, really, which is I think the UN is only as wise as the people that comprise it, the government officials, the bureaucrats, the people that are sent there, the ambassadors and so on. The ones I met on this meeting were brilliant. I mean, they're good people. But there are an awful lot of people that didn't come and that are corrupt and that are in the international system for what they can get out of it. That's a problem. And so how can we deal with that? I think this is where, to me, moral education comes in. Kant made the point that we should be acting in a way that our actions can be universalized. If I tell the truth, that's a valid thing for everybody. But if I start lying for political or economic gain, that brings down society. So that's why I think moral and philosophical education should be part of the world's curriculum. Keats said we're a school for souls, this planet. Well, I don't think we're doing that well at the moment. We're having a blip. The Ukraine war is a blip because a psychopath liar, a KGB operative who lies for a living, seized power and is holding it, and now attacking other nations. So we, the people, have to reclaim the space for truth. Is how I see it. And this Summit of the Future gives us a chance, an opportunity to do that. So anyway, it was a great meeting. So I hope you've gained something. Talking. Yeah, Ponley, do you want to say something? We can hear you.
Yeah, I thank you very much on behalf of the whole of humanity. And I thank God for the energy, the physical and intellectual energy you are giving you. I enjoy your discussion. But I sent a message, I said the recent contribution before the meeting started in your email. So I was thinking I'll be able to read it, but the time has gone. So I just want to communicate to everybody that the solution is epistolar. And it is the history of the evolution of humanity from the time of food gatherer, from the Stone Age, of the master, up to the age of Anthropocene. It's a continuum. The moment, the present is just a moment. So that unless you understand the whole of the history of humanity, the part of life, and that you have to have a comprehensive knowledge. That is versatility and erudition matters very much. The physical sciences, the social sciences, and you have to think about the exemplars, the avatars, Socrates, Aristotle, Rousseau, Montesquieu. Democracy was an evolutionary idea which started from the time of Socrates, thousands of years ago.
Sure. No, Socrates was killed by unjust process that he symbolizes. We can't.
Yeah. What we are doing is fantastic and it's good. The other is but we have to augment this with sponsoring people who so strong that they can write.
Can I make a suggestion, Ponley? Because we can't hear you very well. Your recording is very, very not clear. So maybe next month you can join us on the 30th of April and, we'll give you the floor for a 10 or 15 minute talk. I know you've got a lot to say from Nigeria and you're obviously been doing some deep intellectual work, but try and get a better connection because I don't think most of us can hear what you're saying. And that's unfortunate because I know that you've thought this through at a great level. So let's look forward to your sharing next meeting, okay? And we can be in touch by emails in the meantime. Right, so look, I'm going to say thank you to everyone. Thanks for coming. You know, we'll meet again, as they say in the song, but it must be getting late for you. I know you have other things to do. So thanks for coming, and blessings, and keep the faith. We'll see you next month. Okay, ciao.